Almost there. There we go. Beautiful view of everything. All right, I'm giving my apologies again for those of you joining me through YouTube. Video is not an option today. I'm going to see if I can't get that working by tonight's Mishnah class. But for now, you'll just have to make do with the sound of my voice, which is very distracting. It's I've gotten used to having that little camera up in the corner telling me what's all going on with everyone, but I'm afraid that's just not going to happen today. So bear with me, and we'll do the best we can under the current circumstances. But hopefully you can all hear me just fine. At least Zoom is telling me that you can hear me just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and trust it on what it says. And let me just take one moment here to bump up the font size now that I'm seeing what it looks like in the YouTube feed in order to make it as visible as possible for those. Visible as possible for those who are coming in through that. Okay, there we go. Okay, and nope, down here. Let's get everything. And that scrolled me off where we needed to be. Just this, oh, nope, that's too far. The other direction. There we are. Okay, you get everything lined up, and then you click one thing and it all shifts, and you got to recenter. So is life. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining me as we continue our little Torah R&R, Rashi and Rashbam, and we are picking up in Ki Tisa. And in Ki Tisa, we are going to cover a number of topics, but that'll depend upon how far we can get. So let's go ahead and get the first major topic discussed in the Torah, and then we'll look to Rashi and Rashbam as our commentators of choice. So we're beginning here in chapter 30, and we are on verse 11. I know I would normally give you the story so far, but this section of Torah is quite famous for following the dictate of there is no before or after, meaning that it is up to discussion of exactly where in the chronology the different sections are coming and should be placed. So we're going to talk about that later on when the commentaries bring that up. But for now, just understand that we're going to deal with this as it is, just by itself. Now, Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, "When you take up the head count of the children of Israel in counting them, they are to give each man a ransom for his life for Adonai when they count them, that there be no plague on them when they count them. This is what they are to give. Everyone who goes through the counting, half a shekel of the holy shrine shekel, 20 grains to the shekel, half a shekel, a contribution for Adonai. Everyone who goes through the counting from the ages of 20 years and upward is to give the contribution of Adonai. The rich are not to pay more, and the poor are not to pay less than half a shekel when giving the contribution of Adonai to effect ransom for their lives. You are to take the silver for ransoming from the children of Israel, and are to give it over for the construction service of the tent of the appointment, that it may be for the children of Israel as a reminder before the presence of Adonai to effect ransom for their lives." Okay, so there is a lot that's going on in what appears at first blanch only to be a simple taxation. And I went too far. A simple taxation passage. But let's get a couple of the basic terminology down, although the commentary will have their own spin to put on this. So the first thing to understand is that we are doing a count. That there is an accounting might be a more pleasing English comparison, because this isn't just a 1, 2, 3, 4. This is more like a stock taking. There is more to just more to this activity than merely comprising a final digit, which is, of course, why it has the phrasing that it does. And the second thing that stands out, of course, is this constant repetition of a ransom for his life. Now, the term is kofer in the Hebrew, which may ring a bell if you are going to conjugate it into the frame Kippur, which Yom Kippur, of course, is the same basic structure. So kofer, Kippur, these are all words that are based around this root, which have the meaning of, well, ransom-ish, or atone, or to expiate. There are a number of different ways to try to render this into English, and none of them are 100% satisfying. Now, that's not because the translators have not come up with the right word, but as we have discovered many times in our studies together over the years, sometimes English words and Hebrew words do not map one-to-one in their translation. It may be perfectly fine, excuse me, to say that yeled means boy, and that's nice, but sometimes there are edge cases or even multiple use cases of words in one language that does not apply to another. And that means that the phrase ransom here, using it too strictly in English, we use mostly in a case of a hostage situation, doesn't feel quite right. On the other hand, paying an atonement fee, something that would then prevent a catastrophe, we can see that ransom is not a completely wrong English word. It just has a different register, a different feel to it, to our usual reading mind. And so that's why we can get atonement. Of course, atonement has its own baggage with it. And we're going to need to try and work on this with the aid of our commentary if we're going to get any more depth into what's actually being asked for. But let's talk just very briefly about what is actually being asked, the mechanics of being asked, before we get into the content of why or what it means to the individual. And the mechanics are very simple. Everybody that is 20 years and older that is in the nation has to provide a half shekel, whether they are an older man or whether they are a younger man, again, at that 20 mark, and whether they are rich or whether they are poor. And yes, this is gender specified as ish. This is for men and not for women. And we'll talk about why that might be the case as we go through. But that is the basic structure here. There seem to be some other concerns, but our commentators will help us with that. So let's go ahead and begin here with a Rashbam over on the left. And he is commenting on our verse 11. And Adonai spoke to Moshe saying, when Moshe gathered Israel to separate out the offerings for the Mishkan, he counted them, and this silver was given for the service of the Mishkan, as it is written, and this is found in Exodus 38, the silver of the enumeration of the congregation was 100, and so on and so forth. So what Rashbam is pointing out is that this counting here, this collection here, better term, is going to be referred later on in Exodus 38 as being part of the silver collection for the service of the Mishkan. And that this had a byproduct of providing a counting of the people, that it is doing double duty. It is both collecting as well as counting, and doing both jobs simultaneously. Now, when we get to verse 12, Rashbam continues, when Moses would assemble the Jewish people in order for them to set aside the donations for the building of the tabernacle, he was to use this opportunity to count them, as we were just discussing from his commentary on 11. The silver would be given for the work in the connection with the tabernacle that required use of this metal. In Exodus 38, we are told that a total of 100 talents of silver were used in the construction of the tabernacle. So again, he is making sure that we connect our verse here in chapter 30 to the verses in 38, so that we can see the result of that collection for the construction. Now, we go over to Rashi on the right-hand side, also looking here at verse 12 from chapter 30. We see that he has a slightly different concern on his first comment. So he is focusing on ki tisa, the first operative words in our parasha. This has the meaning of obtaining. Now, what do we mean by obtaining? Well, he's trying to point out that Tisa, like we see in Genesis 40, could be also understood as lifting up, as to elevate something, to raise something. So, are we being commanded here to lift anything physically in any shape or form? No, this is a taking or a receiving of an item. As he points out from the Targum's translation of Tikabel. The sense is, what do we mean then by this ki tisa? Why use that phrase? When you wish to obtain the sum total of their number, that is to say, to know how many they are, a census in modern English, do not take their census by their polls, but each of them shall give half a shekel, and you shall count these, and so ascertain their number. So this idea of taking is a substitute form of counting. Now, why do we need to do that substitute counting? Well, Rashi gives us his commentary in the second half of verse 12, that there be no calamity among them from this translation, or that there be no plague among them from the Fox translation, or negef if you want to have in the Hebrew. Now, what's the issue here? Well, for numbers, that is, things that have been numbered, are subject to the influence of the evil eye, the ayin hara. And therefore, if you count them by their polls, pestilence may befall them, as we find happened in the days of David. And this is referring us to the from 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 10, and onward in that section, where David indeed engages in a census of the nation, and does so in a way that does not fit the instructions that the Torah has given, and there is a plague that comes upon the people afterwards. Now, what do we mean by ayin hara? What is this issue about counting or not counting? Well, Rashi is bringing one interpretation, as he usually does. Sometimes he'll bring a couple more, but he is picking from among the many interpretations of our tradition, and he is trying to help us understand through that interpretation why counting might be a problem. And he is arguing that counting creates a potential for ayin hara that is different than other forms of collecting information. That when you have fully enumerated something in this official 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on number of people, that you are inviting the ayin hara. The ayin hara is a very slippery concept to wrap our head around. The term evil eye, which is a literal translation of ayin hara, is again heavily laden with pop culture baggage in the 21st century, of the way different people have referred to it in movies and books, and also just misunderstanding of theology. And of course, this is something that is debated and complicated. So I'll give you my best attempt at condensing some of the ideas that this represents. So the ayin hara can represent a flaw of pride. That is to say, when somebody has arrogantly boasted or stated their greatness, that you are practically inviting catastrophe. So if you point out that we have X thousand number of people in our army, you are setting yourself up for your arrogance to lead you into problems. Indeed, that's one way of reading the catastrophe that befalls David, is that he is arrogantly looking to stroke his ego by seeing the size of his forces, and in doing so in such a callous and prideful way that it ends up creating so many problems within the nation. The other way of looking at this, which is parallel, is that it doesn't necessarily create a backlash from your own arrogance, but it creates a backlash from others' jealousy. that the ayin hara is the result of the bitterness that other people feel when they see you succeeding. That when you have allowed your success to become so blatant, flaunting, if you will, in front of others, that it is going to create very negative emotions among others. The person who walks in with the flashiest jewelry, or with the drives up in the flashiest car, gets out, smirks and struts, other people might be impressed, but other people might be angered, bittered, or look at this person as being a profligate cad, and as such begin to either actively work against them or to wish them ill because of their boastfulness. So the ayin hara becomes a caution against that sort of conspicuous consumption of flaunting your success. And it need not be purely material. It can be success in your personal life, or success in your business endeavors, just by being satisfied with your career. That one has to be careful of how you speak of that, to be sure that you are not creating unnecessary envy, rivalry, jealousy, bitterness, hatred in the other listeners. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to enjoy your success, of course, but it does mean you have to understand and be cautious of how your enjoyment will be perceived by others around you. Throughout the Torah, and especially in rabbinic literature, this issue of arrogance and pride as creating a negative effect on yourself, leading you to take actions that you should best avoid, or the effect upon others, creating bitterness and jealousy, which will make them take actions that they should avoid, is a very common running theme. So here, Rashi is arguing that the main issue is that by counting the people directly, 1, 2, 3, 4, how many people live in this tent, how many live in this tribe, etc., that you would be creating the ripe grounds for the ayin hara. There is a additional concern when it comes to counting, in that the rabbis were want to say that when you count something, you open up the potential for something to go wrong. That sometimes it is better to leave things uncounted. It is better to leave things unenumerated. The classic example is that if you are praying for a good harvest, you don't pray for a good harvest after you have already counted all of the wheat that you have gathered. You pray before it has been counted, because once it's been counted, you know what you have, and you know whether it's good or bad, and God is not going to change that figure. But while it is still uncounted, there is wiggle room, if you will. There is a certain amount of no man's land that is not yet clarified, and within that area, blessings can still take place. Once it has been solidified in a raw number where there is no room for re-examination, then you are stuck with what you have. And indeed, that's another way of understanding this, that if you completely and absolutely, without any possible element of error, have counted up all of your people, then that's exactly who you have and what you should expect to be with you in battle, as we'll see, is the army count. On the other hand, if you are pretty sure you know how many, because you did this half shekel count for all of them, but you are not 100% sure, for maybe somebody failed to fulfill this part of the mitzvah, then there is still that margin of error that could allow for greater help to arrive than you were expecting. And that is a form of blessing, to allow that it might end up being better than I think kind of attitude. So that's a lot to be said about ayin hara, and let's go ahead and carry on with the commentaries on verse 13. Get everything rolled into position. Oh, no, I need to get that word at the top. There we are. All right, so as you can see from the left, Rashbam is fairly brief on this section. And he points out that this weighing of the 20 grains of the shekel is just a type of coin. So his argument is that the shekel itself is a type of coin. Now, Rashi is going to be a little bit more explicit on this. And he points out, this shall they give. He, meaning God, showed him, meaning Moses, a kind of fiery coin, the weight of which was a half shekel, and said to him, like this shall they give. So again, I'm sorry for my camera being out, because I would love to be able to point in how this language is working. But if you look at verse 13, you'll see that it begins with that phrase, ze, which means this. And this is a demonstrative term. It is seemingly pointing to some reference. It is as though God were holding up an example of what must be given and saying, this is it. Now, the Torah doesn't come with illustrations, so we are left with the verbal description, but the presumption is that Moses would have received a visual understanding of what was needed for the fulfillment of this mitzvah, of what type of coin, what type of shekel, if you will, was going to be used. So Rashi is focusing on the seemingly extraneous gift, the extraneous this. What happens when my eyes are looking at one word and my mouth is trying to say a different one. The extraneous this at the start of the verse is not extraneous at all, but it is reassuring us that Moses was given a very specific description of what needed to be given, and then goes on to focus on this unusual phrasing about how it's to be given. Those that go through the counting. As the translation of Rashi points out, we could read this as everyone that pass among them that are mustered. And this passing is where Rashi is going to be asking his question. Because as we can see, the Torah uses the expression kol ha'over al pikudim, but it could have just said, instead of merely saying kol ha'pikudim, meaning that it could have said all that are counted, as opposed to all that pass that are counted. So what's going on here? Well, the reason it does that, the reason it uses that phrase over in particular, is because it is the practice of those who count animate beings to make them pass before them one after the other, counting them as they pass, as we see in Leviticus 27, as well as Jeremiah 33, where the images are passing under a rod. This was the standard, well, still is to the best of my knowledge, shepherd practice, where when the flock was coming through the gate, the shepherd would have his staff, his crook, to count each one of them. They would pass under it, and that was the way that you would count your sheep carefully, because if you tried to count a swirling flock of sheep, trying to keep track of it would be next to impossible. But putting them through a pass where 1, 2, 3 are going under your staff, well, then you can keep track precisely of who has come under and who has not yet gone under. And so your count is going to be much more accurate. And here too, we are seeing that same verbiage is being used for the counting of the people as they come to provide their half shekel. And then he continues in his analysis of 13, which, as I pointed out, is much more extensive than Rashbam's. That is not unusual between the two commentators. The half shekel, the half of a shekel after the shekel of holiness. Now, after here is a bit of old English. It would be more like as the one, or like the one, or in the manner of one. That is to say, after the weight, meaning according to the weight of the shekel, which I have appointed for you as the standard by which to weigh the shekels used for sacred purposes. As, for instance, those shekels mentioned in the section dealing with estimating things dedicated to the sanctuary and with fields of possession so dedicated, taken from chapter 27 of Leviticus. So he's making sure that we understand that there were different shekels in the ancient world. This is something that's been clearly established through archaeology, both within the land of Israel as well as the surrounding countries, which also used a shekel weight system, that not all shekels were created equally. We're used to standardized measurements in the modern world, whether it be the rational measures of meter and kilogram, or whether it be the slightly less rational measurements of pound or foot. Even in the imperial system, those measurements are very consistent in the modern world. And you wouldn't have a 1 foot for measuring buildings and 1 foot for measuring people. Well, in the ancient world, having different types of measures was entirely common. That was normal. Just to give you a little bit of an example, in the modern world, we still do talk about miles and nautical miles as an example of some of the differences of our measurement conventions. There are still some holdovers, even in the modern world. But in the ancient world, those weren't holdovers, those were normal. So Rashi is pointing out what the Torah is pointing out, which is the half shekel that is brought here is a half shekel according to the shekel that is the holy shekel, meaning the weight that is used for all holy things. That's the type of shekel that should be used here. And as we're going to talk about, the standardization was very important, as everybody had to bring the same. So make sure that you're using the right type of shekel when you're measuring this one. And just to be very clear, in his commentary here, a shekel is 20 gerahs. That is to say, having stated that it must be a holy shekel, it now tells you exactly how much it is. Belt and suspenders, it is making sure that we understand exactly how big this shekel is, that it goes according to the shekel weight that is the sanctuary weight, and that is 20 gerahs, 20 grains, as Fox puts it, 20 subunits of weight. And as Rashi explains, gerah in Hebrew denotes what is called a me'ah, that is a coin of small value in Aramaic. So this is not exactly a penny, but it's a very lower denomination. And in this sense, we find in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel 2, everyone that is left shall come and crouch to him for a piece of the silver and a morsel of bread. So this is the same standard of meaning. And a shekel is 20 gerahs. For a full shekel is 4 zuz, and a zuz was originally 5 meahs. Consequently, a shekel was 20 meahs or gerahs. Only that they increased it, meaning the zuz, by 1/6, and so raised its value to 6 meahs of silver. Now half of this, the original shekel, of which I have spoken to you, shall they give as a heave offering to the Lord. So this truma offering is coming, and Rashi is trying to explain that this rather involved sentence here in verse 13 is needed because the value of the shekels were adjusted at different points. And again, this is a very common feature of the ancient world and really even into the modern world of how currencies are valued or devalued at different times in order to match the needs of that community. And if you thought verse 13 sounded needlessly redundant or very cumbersome, understand, says Rashi, that all of these different points were essential to ensure that the half shekel would always be the correct weight as needed. All right, any questions so far? Okay, then let's go ahead and get into verse 14. Hold on, let me just put you up there. Oh, no, come on. There. All right, computer, that's good enough. Okay, so that's good for that. And then we get Rashi there and we are great. So as we talked about, this counting is only for men that are 20 years and older. So what exactly is happening here? Well, as Rashi explains, scripture teaches you here that anyone less than 20 years of age does not go forth to the army, nor is he to be counted among the men. that we were talking about in this section all the way back in verse 12. So we have our important insight that this is for military muster, and that if you are under the age of 20, that you do not enlist, you are not drafted. Something that I'm sure people in the modern systems are a little bit surprised at, since many of our young people enter into the military at 18, and under certain circumstances, even as young as 17. And God forbid, in some parts of the world or bad parts of our history, people have been drafted at even younger ages. But according to Torah, the age for enlistment is 20 years old. We don't really have time to go into this concept of being counted as a man. I know many of you are probably familiar with the concept of bar mitzvah, of a person being counted as a man from the age of 13. And while that is technically true with regards to their obligation to commandments in the eyes of the community, the short answer is that according to the Torah, a person is not fully responsible for the commandments in the eyes of heaven until they have reached the age of 20. That is the fullness of maturity. And certainly as we are catching up in our understanding of biology and psychology, that is a very good place to begin to put that benchmark, that the human mind is only just beginning to finally settle down at the age of 20, and thus we can say that they are truly a mature adult biologically and potentially psychologically, to truly be held accountable in all respects for their behavior. But of course, a community cannot allow a person to behave inappropriately because they are younger. We need to, from the age of 13 onward, be sure that the community and that the individual is doing their best to make sure their behavior is good and right. Like I said, there's much more to be said about that, but we are working on our commentary, so we will take it, where we get it. Now, in the commentary on verse 15 from Rashi, he is going to focus in on this kippur, this lichaper, of this a ransom effect, this atonement, this expiation. What do we actually mean by that? Well, this is to make an expiation for your souls in order that you may not be liable to the plague in consequence of the census. So that is his first explanation, which is if you count wrong, meaning that you count with a blatant raw census, that you are inviting the ayin hara, you are inviting the plague, and here by using the shekel stand-in as the counting methodology, you are preventing that from happening, and thus you are not liable. So the idea in this first commentary is you've done nothing wrong, so you are not ransoming because you have sinned. You are in effect ransoming to avoid sin, that you are using this half shekel as a precaution against the transgression of counting in an inappropriate manner. But Rashi is going to bring other explanations as well. Another explanation, common Rashi structure for this commentary. So another explanation of to make expiation for themselves is that it was really an atonement for their sins. Meaning, well, but we could interpret this as being they actually did do something wrong, because scripture alludes here to three different heave offerings. Those are the truma offerings, since it uses the expression trumat Adonai, the truma offering for God. In the Fox translation, it is rendered as the contribution. In Old English, it was called the heave offering. I like to just call it truma, because I think the Hebrew has just the right amount of ambiguity without confusing people with English words that either mean something, often something else, or mean something that we no longer understand because we don't use the word heave like that in English anymore. So we're going to call it truma offering as much as possible. But that phrase, trumat Adonai, appears three times, twice in verse 14 and 15, and then in verse 13. So what would those three different truma offerings be referring to? One mention is an allusion to the heave offering, the truma offering, that was to be used for the making of the sockets. For he, meaning Moses, counted them when they began to contribute toward the building of the tabernacle, when each gave half a shekel, the total amounting to 100 talents, as it says in Exodus 38:25, and the silver of them that were numbered of the congregation was 100 talents. And of these the sockets were made, as it is stated in Exodus 28:27, and of the 100 talents of silver were cast the sockets of the sanctuary, and so on. So explanation number one is that there is a truma offering of silver from the half shekels that is used for the building of the Mishkan and the construction of the silver sockets in its form. This is in keeping with the interpretation we saw in Rashbam. But there is more to be said on this topic, says Rashi. The second heave offering, the second usage of the truma terminology, was also levied by way of census, for he numbered them again after the tabernacle was erected. That is the census referred to in the beginning of the book of Numbers, in Numbers 1:1, literally. And the Lord said to Moses, on the first day of the second month of the second year, take the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel. And on that occasion, too, each of them gave a half shekel. These were employed in purchasing the communal sacrifices for each year. Rich and poor were made alike in regard to these half shekels. And it is with reference to this heave offering, truma offering, that the scripture uses here the expression lechaper, to make expiation for your souls. For sacrifices were brought in order to make atonement. So Rashi argues that there was this second offering, or second truma, that was also made with the half shekel, but that was made at the later point when we had actually already finished the construction of the Mishkan, and we were now gathering the funds needed for running the sacrifices in the Mishkan. And there, quite literally, those sacrifices are fulfilling the mitzvah that God has put upon the community to have those sacrifices. And as such, we are making expiation. We are fulfilling our duty and avoiding the transgression of neglect for those sacrifices. So it may look like this is all one single commandment, but in fact, this is played out in three different ways. The first was the collection for the silver, the second being the collection for the money that was needed for running the services. And yet there is also a third section. The third heave offering was that offered for the building of the tabernacle. As it is said, everyone that did offer, Exodus 35, everyone that did offer an offering of silver and brass. In this truma offering, however, they did not all participate alike, but each one brought what was ever his heart prompted him to give. So he's arguing that there was a third one as well, where it was no holds barred. If you wanted to bring a ton, you brought a ton. If you wanted to bring a little, you brought a little. And that one was for the general support of the building, not just the socket construction, which was the first half shekel, but was a general donation for the construction. And all of those have the term Trumat Adonai, the contribution of Adonai, or heave offering, if you want to follow Rashi's translation here. And we should recognize the overlap in many of the points, but not that they are identical in all points. Most notably here that it was being done as a open donation rather than being limited to the identical amount for all involved. All right, now let's take a look at verse 16 with our commentators. Let me get everybody lined up. It's easier to get them lined up and then start talking. Okay, so in verse 16, we were continuing about this gathering of the silver for the expiation, for the ransoming, and the use of it for the construction, as Rashi has now already brought our attention to, and to use. Now, this phrase, Kesef HaKippurim, is finally where Rashbam is going to weigh in and say that this silver, this Kesef, it was intended to atone for the sin of forfeiting one's life. So he is also finally weighing in that this Kippurim does have an atonement, purpose, but he doesn't elaborate in any greater depth upon it, feeling that it is explicit within the text itself of the Torah. And this is one of the features of Rashbam, is sometimes you would love for him to expand a little bit more. Yes, he is wonderful in comparison to Rashi and others because he is short, he is succinct, he is direct, he is holding to the simple or plain meaning of the text in many ways, which are very helpful for unraveling what the Torah is saying on its own terms. But sometimes he is so brief or doesn't chooses not to comment at all, that you are left with still additional questions. And that is why we are very blessed in our nation to have many different commentaries to turn to. And then his second commentary on verse 16 is just continuing to remind ourselves about how that silver was used when the gathering of up to 100 talents. But let's go over to Rashi to see a much greater discussion here, talking about the service of the appointed tense, focusing in on this phrase al avodat ohel moed, and remind you that the word avodah, the root of our phrase here, can mean both to work as well as to serve. Fox has tried to capture that with his construction service phrase, meaning that it could be the building that we're talking about, or it could be the service that we're talking about. Remembering from our last commentary in Rashi that both seem to have been affected by a shekel counting system. So what is Rashi going to say here? From this statement, that you shall give it for the service of the appointed text, you may learn that he, Moses, was commanded to take their census when they began to contribute toward the building of the tabernacle after the incident of the golden calf, because the pestilence had befallen them, as it is said, Exodus 32:35, and the Lord plagued the people. Before we get into his parable to explain that, I mentioned at the very beginning that this whole section is debated regarding where it should fit in the chronology of the Exodus. And here we can see that Rashi is weighing in, saying that it is best situated at in the time slot after the crime of the golden calf, and that is where it is best read. Even though here in the chapter order of the Torah, it is coming 2 chapters early, it would better fit into the chapters following the golden calf as far as where in the historical timeline did it occur. Now, what is the parable of why we would be making this counting after the golden calf and what was going on? Well, the parable he uses to try and explain that. To what may this be compared? To a flock that is dear to its owner, upon whom a pestilence, upon which there fell pestilence. As soon as it ceased, meaning the pestilence, he said to the shepherd, I beg you, count my sheep and ascertain how many of them are left. He did this to show that the flock was dear to him. So the idea being that this counting, when you put it after the plague of the golden calf, was in order to show the people that God still cared. If God didn't care, then he wouldn't mind how many were dead, how many were left. Who cares? They're all rubbish anyway. Golden calf was just a terrible idea, and I don't have any interest in you at all. No, we don't say that, because God was so concerned after the catastrophe that he demonstrated to us that concern through the counting. As always, please do not make the mistake of thinking this means God didn't know how many people were there and how many perished and all of that. Of course, God knew all of that, but we didn't know that God still cared for us. There was a long period following the golden calf where we needed the reassurance for ourselves that God still cared about us. And taking the time to force us to count so that we would demonstrate to God how many of us there were is a way for God to demonstrate to us that God still cares how many of us there are. It is, however, impossible to say that the census mentioned here is identical with that spoken of in the book of Numbers, which we already talked about. Scripture states, and God spoke to Moses on the first day of the second month, take the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel, which we got from Numbers 1:1. While the tabernacle, the Mishkan itself, was set up on the first day of the first month, as it is said in Exodus 40, on the first day of the month, on the first day of the first month shall you set up the tabernacle. And from this sentence, that mentioned in this paragraph, from the shekels obtained by it, the sockets were used for its board were made, for it is said, Exodus 38:27, and of the 100 talents of silver were cast in the sockets of the sanctuary. What do we learn from all of that? Consequently, you learn from this that 2 censuses were taken, one at the beginning of their contributing toward the tabernacle after the Day of Atonement, when Moses first commanded the people to engage in the construction of the tabernacle in the first year, and the other in the second year, in Iyar, the second month, after the tabernacle had already been set up. So he's arguing that there needs to be 2 different censi? They need to be 2 different countings, because one of them is clearly being done in the lead up towards the construction of the tabernacle in order to produce the silver needed for the sockets that will hold it all together. And that had to be done during the first year of our exodus from Egypt. And the second is being very deliberately stated that it's being done in the second month of the second year after the tabernacle had thus been constructed, which means there had to be a second counting. Now, that seems very clear, and we're very grateful for Rashi using the Midrash to point that out to us, but there might still be a question. If you ask, however, is it at all possible that on both of these occasions, the number of the Israelites was exactly the same, the 603,550, for in the account of how the silver of those that were numbered by the congregation was used, Exodus 38:27, it is so stated, and in the book of Numbers, chapter 1, verse 46, exactly the same is stated. Even all they that were numbered were 600,000, 3,550. Meaning, how can these be identical when it was done with multiple months in between them? Were not these sentences taken in 2 different years? And surely it is impossible that there were not at the time of the first census people 19 years old who accordingly were not counted and who became 20 years old in the second year when the second census was taken, and this must have added to the total. So even if for no other reason, not worrying about people perishing from illness or from other problems, you would have to at least it would boggle the mind to imagine that no one who was just too young to be counted in the first census would not have already reached the age of 20 by the time of the second census. Surely someone in that throng would have turned the corner on that birthday. So how do we explain the fact that 2 censuses taken quite far apart were identical? Well, the reply to this question is, as far as the years of men ages are concerned, they were counted in the same year. But reckoning from the time of the exodus from Egypt, they were 2 different years in which the censuses were held. Censuses. He explains what the plural is for me. Thank you. Okay, so what does that mean that ages are counted in 1 year and the Exodus is counted in a different year? Well, it simply means that there were different chronologies and different counts. This was common in the ancient world, where you would count according to either who was king or from a famous historical time or from the last harvest. There were different years that were being tracked because each year had its own purpose. As he explains, for when we speak of a period beginning with the Exodus from Egypt, which took place in Nisan, a holiday of Pesach, we calculate from Nisan, as we have learned in the Masechet, the section of the Talmud, Rosh Hashanah 2b. Consequently, the tabernacle was being built in the first year and was erected in the second year because a new year began on the 1st of Nisan following the Exodus. As soon as we hit Nisan number 2, meaning the second Nisan the Nisan that came after the first one, which was the original Exodus and first Pesach, when we reach that second Nisan, we are now in year 2. It is now 12 months after the Exodus from Egypt. The years of people's ages, however, were counted according to the era of the creation of the world, which begins with Tishrei, more commonly known as Rosh Hashanah. Consequently, from this point of view, both censuses took place in the same year. The first is in Tishrei after the Day of Atonement, when the Omnipresent became reconciled with Israel to grant them his pardon, and when they received the command regarding the construction of the tabernacle. So according to the careful counting of days from the time that we reached Sinai, and then Moses going up and down, the golden calf, and up and down again, by the time we get the reconciliation from all of that, it is the day of Yom Kippur, which is the 10th of Tishrei, which is its own year marker. I mean, Rosh Hashanah at the beginning of Tishrei is its own year marker. So we get the command on the 10th of Tishrei. We do our half shekel donation for the silver that is going to be used for the sockets on the 10th of Tishrei in that year. And the second on the 1st of Iyar, the second counting, so that those who were only 19 years old after the Day of Atonement, when the first census was taken, were not yet regarded as 20 in Iyar when the second census was held, even though they were born between Tishrei and Iyar. So rather than counting each person's own birthday and the day they were born on, people were just counting their birthdays from Rosh Hashanah, the 1st of Tishrei. And by the time we get to the second year of the Exodus, we are still within that year that began with Tishrei, where we had the blunder with the golden calf and the reconciliation with God, and the first census being done for the silver for the sockets. And the second census being done in Iyar, when we are gathering the silver for the service in the temple, was still within the same calendar year, even though it was now in the second historical year counting from the Exodus. So again, I wish my camera were working today and I could show you sort of visualize the timelines here, but it means that there was a window between Tishrei and Iyar where it was the same calendar year counting from creation, but it had now become a different period year, era year, counting from the time of the Exodus. And since people were only being numbered based upon their age at the time of Tishrei, at the time of Rosh Hashanah, rather than their own individual birthdays, that meant that no one had a, quote, birthday between Tishrei and Iyar, because you would have to wait until the next Tishrei for all of those who were 19 in Tishrei to finally become 20 in the next Tishrei. You might be wondering, why would people not necessarily have had their own private birthdays? I mean, after all, we celebrate birthdays all the time these days. Why didn't they? And the short answer is because birthdays were not always remembered. Because of the terrible scourges of infancy and child mortality, oftentimes in the ancient world, and really until quite recently, families may or may not make a particular note of the day a child was born. Sometimes they would simply wait to see, is the child going to survive long enough for us to, if you will, establish them as being a long-term permanent member of the family. We still have to keep track of how old they are, so we remember what year they were born in, but we may not remember the exact month and day of that year that they were born in. And so children's birthdays were not recorded very carefully during much of our history. This is why, for example, if you go back and look in many biographies of famous Jewish people throughout the ages, you'll often find a circa definition of when they were born, and you will find a precise date for when they passed away. Because by the time they passed away, the community now recognized the people that we still have records for as being important and significant to the community. And so their day of passing, their yahrzeit, became noted because it was a significant loss for the community when that person passed away. And they were then commemorated by their respective communities. And so when you look through Jewish encyclopedias, or I suppose now Wikipedia, you'll often find the birth year and then you'll find a death date. And that reflects the unfortunate realities of life in the ancient world. And as such, that also explains the potential conflict between the census here and the census that takes place in the book of Bamidbar. It is a wonderful example through Rashi's commentary that sometimes the problems that we think we perceive in the text are based upon assumptions that we have because we are distant from the realities that were just assumed in the ancient world to be shared by one and all. Now, this is a particular reality that I'm glad that we are distant from. I am glad that we take the birth of a child as being monumental and significant, and we record everything about it from day one, because it means that we have turned a huge milestone in the survivability of our children, and that we are always full of hope and expectation for each and every one of them. And that reflects well upon the advances we have made as a society to be able to provide good medical treatment and care to the mothers and children of all people, and something that I hope we only get better and better at. We're going to go ahead and stop there because, unfortunately, I've got another meeting in just another minute, which I'll also have to do without a camera. But I want to make sure if people have any questions that you get a chance to ask. All right, I'm not hearing anyone, and I'm not seeing anyone typing up. Oh, I do see that someone was wishing a Hag Purim. And yes, Purim Sameach to you as well. I hope that everyone did have a great Purim on Monday and Tuesday, Monday night and Tuesday day. And look forward to celebrating all the additional holidays and special days that are coming up very, very soon. I always feel like once Purim happens, it's off to the races as Pesach comes galloping up so fast. And then with Pesach hitting, there's so many other special things happening. So I hope everybody had a restful winter and is now rushing into springtime in the Jewish calendar. Take care, everyone, and be well.